Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Hoover Institution Library and Archives Symposium on the historiography of the Pacific War, past accomplishments, and future challenges. On this, the 80th anniversary of a day that will live in infamy, the December 7th, 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. My name is Eric Wakin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution and the Director of its famed Library and Archives. Hoover is honored to host this panel of leading military historians of the Pacific War as we remember the 2,403 service members and civilians who were killed and the 1,178 people injured in the surprise attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy on American military installations in Oahu, Hawaii. We thank the Fuchida family who generously gifted the private collection of Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the lead bomber aviator in this first wave of the Pearl Harbor attack, and who also gained prominence in the post-war period, due, among other things, to the publication of his book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, the Japanese Navy Story. Taking Fuchida's legacy as a point of departure, our speakers will reflect upon the complex process of understanding, awareness, knowledge, and memory of the Pacific War. They will share with us a fresh look at the research trends and accomplishments over the past 8 decades and discuss new challenges and missions for the next generation of students and researchers of World War II in Asia and in the Pacific. This event and the acquisition of the Fuchida papers could not have been done without the efforts of our dedicated staff of curators, preservation staff, description colleagues, digitization colleagues, and exhibitions colleagues. We would like to encourage you to all visit the Fanning the Flames, our exhibit, Fanning the Flames, Propaganda in Modern Japan. We have a digital exhibit on the website at fanningtheflames.hoover.org. And there's also an accompanying physical exhibit in the Hoover Tower for those of you who are in Palo Alto in the next few months. At the end of today's symposium, our curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection and Initiative, Dr. Kei Ueda, will provide more information and some concluding remarks. I also want to pre-thank our panelists for their presentations. I'm very excited to hear them, and thank you for being here. Finally, I would like to note how fortunate we are to have the support of the director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, and our board of overseers, our board of directors in these varied endeavors, as we are almost entirely funded privately through the generosity of our supporters, without whom our work would be impossible. With that, I will turn things over to our moderators today, Professor Yuma Totani, Professor of History on Modern Japan at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the co-author, most recently, of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, Law, History, and Jurisprudence. Dr. Totani will introduce today's speakers and explain the theme of today's symposium. Please welcome Professor Totani. Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings from the island of Oahu. My name is Yuma Totani. I'm a historian of modern Japan at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a visiting fellow at Hoover. I would like to begin by thanking the Hoover Institution Library and Archives Director, Eric Wakin, the Japanese Diaspora Collection Curator, Kei Ueda, and a number of Hoover colleagues, friends, and staff for making today's event possible. I would like to express my special thanks to Professor Ronald Spector, Mr. Jonathan Paschal, and Mr. Richard Frank for accepting the invitation to join today's symposium. My heartfelt gratitude goes to the Fuchida family, who generously gifted the papers of Captain Mitsuo Fuchida to the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. And my words of appreciation also go to all of you for being with us via Zoom today. Today's symposium is organized as follows. Our guests will speak for about a half hour each in the order of Professor Spector, Mr. Paschal, and Mr. Frank. We will hold off Q&A until the completion of all 3 presentations. However, I invite our Zoom participants to begin posting questions using the Q&A function during our panelists' presentations. Please make sure that unless you wish to stay anonymous, you indicate your name, your title, and your affiliation, and to whom you are putting your question. Questions that are collected in this manner will be put to a guest right after the presentation by a third speaker. Allow me to say a few things about the theme of today's symposium before introducing our first speaker. Today's theme, the Trans-Pacific Knowledge Production and Transfer concerning World War II in Asia and the Pacific, has a long history whose origin can be traced back to the Allied occupation of Japan, which took place between September 1945 and April 1952. The so-called Japanese monographs, which comprise 202 reports produced by the former Japanese Army and Navy officers following the end of hostilities by the direction of the US occupation forces, are one such example of the Trans-Pacific knowledge production and transfer. According to a short history of the Japanese monographs program by the Histories Division of the Office of the Chief of Military History of the US Army, these reports are used, and I quote, to support the writing of those volumes of the series US Army in World War II, which dealt with the war in the Far East theater, end of quote. Here they are referring to a segment of the 90+ volume series, the US Army in World War II, also known as the Green Books. Shortly after the completion of the Japanese monographs, a 102-volume Japanese war history series known as Senshi Sosho was compiled and published between 1966 and 1980 by the collaborative work of some 134 Japanese individuals, the vast majority of whom being former Army and Navy officers. This series is another example of Trans-Pacific knowledge production and transfer to the extent that it made use of the official war history series and other published and unpublished sources from the countries formerly at war with Japan, such as Australia, China, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, for the purpose of verifying information, filling many gaps that the extant Japanese military records could not fill, and incorporating the Allied perspectives of battles, campaigns, and strategies. Trans-Pacific production and transfer of knowledge on the war has occurred in 3 other notable manners. 1, translation into other languages of memoirs, diaries, and so on, written by the former Japanese Army and Navy officers. 2, translation into other languages of research outputs by military historians in Japan. And 3, use of Japanese language oral histories and archival materials for the production of research pieces by military historians outside Japan. In sum, the history of World War II in Asia and the Pacific as a field of study is characterized by a long and rich tradition of knowledge sharing. This state of affairs prompts us today to inquire about their impacts. For instance, what has been accomplished exactly from the decades-long Trans-Pacific research and knowledge sharing? Has there been any difficulty in translating and transplanting the knowledge thus produced? To what extent has the general public benefited from the new knowledge of the war thus gained in the past 7 decades? These are just a few of many questions that we hope to address at today's symposium. With that note, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ronald Spector. Professor Spector is Emeritus Professor of History and International Relations in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He has a long and distinguished career in teaching and researching the history of modern warfare, and especially the Pacific War and the Vietnam War. Aside from 30 years of teaching at the Elliott School, Professor Spector has taught at the University of Alabama and at Louisiana State University, held the position of a Fulbright lecturer in India, Israel, and Singapore, named the class of 1957 Distinguished Visiting Professor of Naval History at the US Naval Academy, served as a visiting professor of strategy at the National War College, served as a Harold K. Johnson Visiting Professor of Military History at the US Army War College, held the position of a distinguished guest professor at Keio University in Tokyo, served as a visiting professor at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, and served as a visiting professor at Princeton. In addition, he has held the position of the Director of Naval History in the US Department of Defense. Professor Spector served in the US military, having earned the rank of a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserve. His military service includes being on active duty during the Vietnam War in 1968 and 69, the Lebanon Grenada operations in 1982 and 83, and the Gulf War in 1991. He's a graduate of the Expeditionary Warfare School at Quantico and served 2 tours on the adjunct faculty of the US Marine Corps Command and Staff College. Professor Spector has published extensively, and his books won many prestigious awards and recognitions. His representative publications are Eagle Against the Sun, The American War with Japan, which received the 1986 Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt Prize in Naval History. After Tet, The Bloodiest Year in Vietnam, published in 1993. At War at Sea, Sailors and Naval Combat in the 20th Century, which received the 2002 Distinguished Book Award of the Society for Military History, and In the Ruins of Empire, The Japanese Surrender and the Battle for Post-War Asia, published in 2007. In 2012, he received the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize of the Society for Military History for his career achievement. I met Professor Spector for the first time just about 1 month ago, but I have long regarded him as a teacher and mentor on account of Eagle Against the Sun and In the Ruins of Empire, which I greatly admire for their wide-ranging vision, powerful narrative, concision of the prose, and judiciousness of analysis and assessments. It is thus a true honor for me to introduce him and welcome him as the first speaker of our symposium today. His presentation is titled, Two Events and Iconic Image, Remembering, Forgetting, and Reimagining the Asia-Pacific War at 80. Professor Spector.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Having to address such a broad subject as the historiography, 80 years of the historiography of the Asia-Pacific War is a task that reminds me of a story I once heard at LSU, Louisiana State University, which was my first civilian job. And at the LSU, they, right after World War II, they had a chairman of the department named Joe Bob, who had been chairman for a number of years and was a good friend of the president of the university. After World War II, however, the department began to hire a bunch of new people, PhDs, people from up north, smart Alecs who thought they knew everything. And they really didn't show the proper respect for Joe Bob. And he, in his turn, was not very comfortable with them. So after conferring with the dean for a while, the dean said to him, with the president said to him, you know, Joe Bob, what you need to do, you need to write a book. You need to write a book, Joe Bob. And then when you're almost finished with your book, we're going to hold a seminar. We're going to invite the other department chairs. We're going to invite the deans. We're going to invite the mayor. And that will show all these young, smart Alecs from up north about how you can do the job. So after a year or two, Joe Bob indicated that he was ready, and the president convened this large seminar, and Joe Bob appeared carrying a large box full of cardboard file cards, and which he plumped on the table. And the chairman said to him, where in hell's your book, Joe Bob? And Joe Bob replied, well, it's all here. I just have to pull it together. So I'm afraid I might have to say the same thing about my presentation today. It's all here. I just have to pull it together. In 1947, James A. Michener wrote, "They will live a long time, these men of the South Pacific. They had an American quality. They, like their victories, will be remembered as long as our generation lives. After that, they will become strangers. Longer and longer shadows will obscure them until their Guadalcanal will sound distant on the ear, like Shiloh and Valley Forge." Michener was a mediocre historian, an immensely successful novelist, and a first-rate prophet. 80 years later, the war with Japan, or what we now prefer to call the Asia-Pacific War, is remembered in a way that might appear weirdly truncated to those Americans who actually experienced it. Popular American memory of the campaigns and battles of the Pacific War have almost completely faded. Even 10 years ago, it was undoubtedly a wise decision by Tony Award-winning set designer Michael Juergen to feature a huge map of the South Pacific Ocean as the stage backdrop for the 2010 revival of Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical South Pacific. Juergen was probably aware that almost nobody in the audience, aside from a few scuba diving enthusiasts, would have the faintest notion where the New Hebrides, the Solomons, New Caledonia, and Rabaul were located. Even the names of American admirals and generals whose pictures were once featured in newsreels and adorned the covers of magazines are now almost completely forgotten, as are some of the 1940s media's favorite heroes. Marine Medal of Honor winner John Basilone, fighter aces Pappy Boyington and Butch O'Hara. None of these are remembered now. It would be interesting to learn whether even one passenger in 100 at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport could identify the man for whom it is named. The one exception is General Douglas MacArthur, who inspired both intense admiration and intense loathing among thousands of American servicemen and their families. Shortly after his election, President Donald Trump declared that he was looking for a MacArthur-type general to direct national security affairs. The president's remark was in keeping with the worshipful attitude of many Americans, like Republican Representative Dewey Short of Missouri, who, after listening to MacArthur's 1951 address to a joint session of Congress, declared that it was like hearing the voice of God. Well, MacArthur may or may not have been a military genius, but he was certainly a genius at public relations. Even today, many people who have heard something about the Pacific campaigns have the impression that MacArthur directed all of them, that he bore considerable responsibility for the American disaster in the Philippines in 1941 and 42, and that he subsequently presided over what turned out to be a secondary theater in the Pacific, is recognized only by military history enthusiasts and academics. Reviewing HBO's The Pacific, the series, the HBO series, The Pacific in 2010, the New Yorker's television critic, Nancy Franklin, observed that at the time of Pearl Harbor, Americans had almost no knowledge of the Pacific. Most Americans knew about France, Germany, and Italy, where the war in Europe was being waged. But as she said, Guadalcanal was a different story. Virtually no one had heard of it before 1942, and even some of the military higher-ups had trouble pronouncing it at first. Americans got to know these places: Guam, Saipan, Wake Island, Bougainville, Okinawa, and what the fight was about, but they didn't hand this knowledge down. By the time the next generation came of age, the war in the Pacific had been essentially reduced to two events and an iconic symbol. The two events are the Pearl Harbor attack and the use of the atomic bomb against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The iconic symbol is Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal's famous picture of the Marines raising the American flag on Iwo Jima. During the 30 or 40 years after VJ Day, controversy surrounding Pearl Harbor, or more specifically, who was to blame for Pearl Harbor, captured a large audience in the United States, with no shortage of conspiracy theories and demands for vindication put forward by various writers, politicians, and retired military officers. It wouldn't surprise me if the number of books published about Pearl Harbor equaled the number of books published about the entire Pacific War. There is still plenty of interest in Pearl Harbor, but the passionate feuds seem to have largely abated. Although Pacific Fleet Commander Rear Admiral Husband E. Kimmel's grandson, Tom Kimmel, has continued his crusade for his grandfather's posthumous promotion well into 2019. Similarly, the debate about the American use of the atomic bomb against Japan appears to have experienced its heyday from the late 1970s to the mid-1990s. During that time, a number of academics were able to build entire careers by painstakingly arguing over the counterfactual speculations surrounding the subject. And while this type of discussion provided endless opportunities for scholarly conferences, it unexpectedly became the subject of public controversy in the early 1990s, when the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum planned to display the Enola Gay, the B-29 bomber that had dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, as part of a wide-ranging exhibit that addressed the entire question of the use of the atomic bomb and its role in the surrender of Japan. And the Smithsonian had also obtained the cooperation of Japanese scholars and the use of some artifacts from Hiroshima. Well, that project of the Air and Space Museum touched off a heated public debate that eventually involved the Air Force Association, the US Senate, prominent academics, veterans organizations, and the editorial pages of various newspapers. In the end, the director of the Air and Space Museum resigned. Congress came perilously close to requiring an official version of the history of the Pacific War, and the exhibit was pared down to a simple display of the Enola Gay's fuselage. After that, both sides appear to have exhausted themselves. The complete Enola Gay finally went on exhibit in 2003 at the Air and Space Museum's gigantic new annex near Dulles Airport. While research into the history of the nuclear age continued, aided by organizations such as the Atomic Heritage Foundation and the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in New Mexico. Since this is a meeting about historiography, I ought to add that the Atomic Heritage Foundation's Oral History Project, directed by its then Vice President, Alexandra Levy, between about 2010 and 2017, provides an invaluable source of information on the Manhattan Project from all perspectives, ranging from that of renowned physicists to Native Americans living in the areas of the super secret nuclear sites. Significantly, the study of both of these subjects, Pearl Harbor and the atomic bomb, despite their fascination for conspiracy theorists, cultural critics, and assorted public intellectuals of all varieties, study of these subjects, I contend, contributes relatively little to our understanding of why the Asia-Pacific War developed as it did, why the Americans and their allies won, and why the Japanese lost. Most of that work has been done by a much smaller number of writers, including notably the two other members of this panel and other authors such as Edward Dray, Thomas C. Hone and Trent Hone, James Hornfisher, John Ludstrom, John McManus, Edward Miller, Mark Peattie, and Hans van de Ven. Now, only a minority of these people are professional historians, but their work is as thorough and wide-ranging as any academic book. They utilize a great assortment of primary records and often multinational sources to bring a variety of perspectives to the study of warfare in Asia and the Pacific. And I won't try to discuss all of this work, all of their work at this time. Plus, I'm not qualified to discuss all of their work. But I'd like to take a look at one example, the China Theater. For many years after World War II, the history of the war in China, from the American perspective, was dominated by one book. That was Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and the American Experience in China. Stilwell and the American Experience in China. There were also the 3 volumes of the U.S. Army's History of the China, Burma, India Theater, ably researched and written by Charles Romanes and Riley Sunderland, 2 officers who had spent almost the entire war period in China and Burma. Their books were far more detailed and balanced than Tuchman's, but they contained little to contradict her general conclusion that the American effort in the China theater was a noble but generally ineffective undertaking. That was primarily due, they said, and Tuchman said, to the internal divisions, corruption, and inefficiency of the Kuomintang, particularly to the arrogance, stubbornness, and ineptitude of Chiang Kai-shek. At this point, in the interest of truth in advertising, I should mention that it was Charles Romanes who first introduced me to the ins and outs of research in the China, Burma, India records way back in the days when they were still stored in cardboard boxes in a federal records center. When I was writing my book, Eagle Against the Sun, in the late 1970s and early 80s, my views generally reflected the Tuchman perspective, as well as the views of a number of CBI veterans, including my uncle, who had served in both the 14th Air Force and the Air Transport Service. These veterans retained a great fascination with and affection for China, as reflected in their newsletter, Ex-CBI Roundup, along with a suspicion that perhaps their efforts and their great adventure had all been for naught. Writing only a few years after my return from Vietnam, I readily associated Chiang's regime with the South Vietnamese government in Saigon, which I and most other Marines, that is, other Marines who were even aware of its existence, saw as a hopeless and incompetent and an obstacle to any real progress. It was easy to identify with Stilwell and Marshall's impatience and annoyance with Chiang Kai-shek and his regime. I have since learned that the situation was a bit more complicated than that, both in Chongqing in 1942-45 and Saigon during 1968 and 69. But at the time, the comparison seemed clear and striking. Richard Frank's recent Tower of Skulls demonstrates a far more sophisticated understanding of the Second World War in China, reflecting the excellent scholarly work of the multinational contributors to Mark Peattie, Edward Dray, and Hans van de Ven's book, The Battle for China, as well as other works by these three authors and by scholars like Rana Mittar and Jay Taylor. Nevertheless, while historical writing about World War II in the United States had become broader, more thorough, and more sophisticated, a popular understanding of the Asia-Pacific War 80 years on has indeed become reduced to Nancy Mitchell's To Avenged and an Image. As living memory of the war becomes almost extinct, it has been replaced by a sort of national romanticism, along with a kind of nostalgia. By the beginning of the 21st century, with only a small percentage of the American population having experienced war or even military service, the imagination of journalists, novelists, movie makers, and TV personality was given free rein. The discovery of the greatest generation, by what one writer has called the Ambrose Brokaw Spielberg industrial complex, might itself be viewed as a byproduct of this process of forgetting. According to Tom Brokaw, the generation of Americans that experienced and fought in World War II, he defines them as those born between 1901 and 1924, were characterized by personal responsibility, a strong work ethic, a sense of duty, honor, commitment, and self-sacrifice. And of course, he called them collectively the greatest generation. Presumably, Americans who were born before or after that time, including most of those who fought at Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne in the First World War, or at Pusan and the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, or the Ia Drang and Khe Sanh in Vietnam. All of these people were, excuse me, were less endowed with those qualities. In fact, the entire concept of the greatest generation tends to lose whatever explanatory power it may claim to have when one considers that a considerable number of veterans of World War I also served in World War II, while not a few World War II veterans also served in the Korean and the Vietnam Wars. By implication, the greatest generation, through their bravery, dedication, and self-sacrifice, left the US and indeed the world a better place. It is hard to argue with that conclusion, but peace and security in the post-war world were remarkably short-lived. By 1947, before the last American war dead had been brought home for burial in the United States, Winston Churchill had warned that an Iron Curtain had descended over Europe. In Asia, almost all of the countries that Americans had fought to liberate from the Japanese were again at war, either against their former colonial rulers or between themselves, sometimes both at the same time. In 1960, in his inaugural address, President John F. Kennedy, a member of the greatest generation, declared that he and his contemporaries had had to confront a hard and bitter peace during the years following World War II. In a recent book entitled Looking for the Good War, West Point professor Elizabeth Samet suggests that Americans have tended to measure all subsequent conflicts against the experience of World War II, although in fact, knowledge of that war has become increasingly mythologized. Our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who came of age during the late 1930s and early 1940s, most of whom have passed on, might be rather surprised to know that they were now officially the greatest generation, that indeed any adult who was alive during that period is now a hero and a patriot. But they probably would have accepted it gracefully. After all, one does not argue with one's grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Spector. As I said earlier, we hold off Q&A until the end of the panel's presentation, but I do invite Zoom participants to start posting questions. For now, I'd like to move on to introducing our next speaker, Mr. Jonathan Parshall. Mr. Parshall is a lecturer for the US Naval War College and a frequent speaker for the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, the National World War II Museum, and the National Museum of the Pacific War, among other venues. He has published widely in historical journals and magazines, including the US Navy Naval War College Review, the Naval History Magazine, Proceedings of the US Naval Institute, World War II Magazine, and Wartime Magazine of the Australian War Memorial, among others. He has also made appearances on TV and streaming videos such as Netflix, the BBC, the Smithsonian Channel, the National Geographic Channel, Discovery Channel, and History Channel. Mr. Basho made his mark in the field of military history with the 2005 publication of Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, which was co-authored with Mr. Anthony Tully. This massive, exhaustive, yet highly readable study of the Battle of Midway in part takes a fresh look at the 1955 publication by Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya titled Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. The book Midway, which was first published in Japan in 1951, has had profound impacts on the ways in which the battle came to be written and remembered in the West. And yet, as Mr. Basho and Mr. Tully discovered over the course of their research, this book contained misinformation. Memoirs, by definition, contain a mix of truth, half-truth, myth, and fiction, whose narrative goal is not so much to establish the truth as to tell a version of reality according to the author's biases, agenda, and priorities. Fuchida's and Okumiya's Midway in this regard was no exception, to the extent that the authors themselves were stakeholders and had a vested interest in shaping the memory of the Midway battle. Although the stated purpose of their book was to set the record straight about the battle by drawing upon voluminous official materials and private records. The question is, how did the account of the battle remain uncontested for such a long time, that is for some 5 decades, until the appearance of Shattered Sword? This question is worth posing, given that the book Midway did not seem to have had the kind of profound impacts it has in the West, insofar as the post-war Japanese historical research on the Pacific War was concerned. In his presentation today, Mr. Basho will reflect on the challenges he and his colleague have faced in researching the Battle of Midway, the research methods with which they grappled with and overcame the challenges, and the implications of their research experiences for the future study of the Pacific War. His presentation is titled, My Life with Fuchida, Modern Pacific War Historiography and the Quest for Source Diversity. Mr. Basho.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. So yes, the title of my talk today is My Life with Fuchida, which is somewhat ironic. Obviously, I never met Mitsuo Fuchida. He died when I was 13 years old. And yet at the same time, I think it's fair to say that no other Pacific War historian has had his name more closely associated with Mitsuo Fuchida than myself. I am profoundly uncomfortable with the role that has sort of fallen into my lap. I'm the guy that got Fuchida. That was never part of the agenda when Tony and I set out to write a book around 20 years ago. And in fact, we did not become aware of some of Fuchida's misstatements until we were practically halfway through the project. And just at a personal level too, I feel like I would have enjoyed having a beer with Mitsuo Fuchida. He seemed like a fascinating individual. He was certainly a very intelligent, interesting, charismatic man. I think he would have been a lot of fun to just sit down and hear some of his stories, whether they were true or not. So I want to sort of carry that attitude through the talk as I give it here, that this is a man I actually would have very much liked to have known. The things I want to do today are to talk a little bit about how Shattered Sword was written. And I think for a lot of people, what it is that historians actually do is sort of a mystery. And I hope to illustrate, what Tony and I went through to actually make this book a reality. I do want to spend a little time talking as well about Fuchida himself, the man and the myth maker, and how it was that he came to impact Pacific War history as greatly as he did. And then finally, I want to wrap up and talk a little bit about what I see as sort of current and future directions within the Pacific War for future works. So without further ado, writing Shattered Sword, or how to write a book from the Japanese perspective when your own Nihongo is absolutely terrible. And as evidence for that, I present to you my freshman year transcript from Carleton College and the grades that I received in Japanese, which never were higher than a C+. In fact, I ended up dropping Japanese entirely my sophomore year because my teacher told me that I was simply going to flunk out. I think if you had told her, that, yeah, in 20 years, this guy is going to write a book on the Japanese side of Midway, she would have either laughed you out of the room or probably been violently ill. The state of things when Tony and I got busy in around 2000 was that there was a very small corpus of sources that one used to study Midway. And they were, roughly speaking, first of all, the Nagumo report, which was the captured after action report of Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the Japanese task force, which was captured on Saipan and translated by ONI in 1947. There are a series of interviews in the Strategic Bombing Survey, and I neglected to mention here also the Japanese monographs as well, which were prepared shortly after the war concluded. And then finally, of course, is Fuchida's book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, that came out around the time that the occupation ended and then was very quickly translated into English and became an important source in the American market. And to that might also be added a series of interviews that were given by a number of different Japanese officers, first to Gordon Prang, and then also to Walter Lord. Unfortunately, Prang's interviews were not accessible. They were frankly sort of hoarded by first Prang and then his successor, Donald Goldstein, and were not made widely available to researchers. I was certainly one of those that they were not made widely available to. Walter Lord, on the other hand, was much more generous with his materials, aided Tony and myself tremendously in the preparation of our book. But this is really about it in terms of, Japanese source material, if you will. And so Tony and I then set out to try to expand that as much as we could. The source we very much wanted to use, of course, would have been the Midway volume of Senshi Sosho, which is the official war history series in Japan. Unfortunately, there is no English translation of this work. Tony and I did get spot translations here and there when we would become aware of, that paragraph looks interesting. We worked with a translator to go out and get a spot translation. But by and large, we were unable to use it in its entirety. And instead, I was reduced to, in many cases, just using it for the pictures that it contained, things like formation diagrams of Japanese warships, and also things like the pre-battle war games that the Japanese conducted in order to plot out the operation. To this were added other sources such as this one, Kojin Shah's mechanisms warships, their aircraft carriers. I spent a lot of time becoming intimately familiar with the 4 aircraft carriers that were sunk during this battle, and to the point that they almost became, in my mind, dramatis personae of their own, that they had their own personalities. That was very, very important to me. And so I spent a lot of time, frankly, just looking at drawings of the internals of these vessels, the bridge of Akagi, the engine spaces of Hiryu, because it was important to me, if I'm going to be able to convey narratively, for instance, how it was that an ensign made his way from the anchor deck of Akagi into the bowels of that ship and down into the engineering spaces to assess whether or not the propulsion plant could be reactivated again. I need to be intimately familiar with what that journey looked like, where that ensign went through, what he would have seen in the course of having done that. Similarly, we got a hold of private ship plans magazines from Japan, Senzen Senpaku, which had numbers of contemporary plans of the Japanese warships. Some of them in other sources were considerably larger in size. And I had a friend in Japan, a former Navy constructor himself, Yoshida Akihiko, who very kindly translated a number of these plans for me, such that I was then able to take those plans, amalgamate them, turn them into my own drawings so that I could do things like understanding what the stowage arrangements would have been below decks. Those in turn became very large, detailed color drawings of the aircraft carriers, which went into the book itself. And as you can see from this screen capture of my vector drawing package, you know, I really got down on the weeds on these things, even to the point of trying to determine, you know, okay, on the air control station on Akagi, are we using 8 centimeter or 12 centimeter spotting binoculars? I was definitely down the rabbit hole here. We were able to find online a site that contained dozens and dozens of rosters of Japanese warships, what their crew component looked like. And so then I dutifully got out my kanji dictionary and translated, you know, all of the various ranks so that I could then get a sense for what the crew makeup looked like. So in this case, for instance, we knew that the carrier Kaga went into battle with a nominal roster of 1,708 individuals who were broken down into various departments, and you could see those departments laid out in the tables below. So this was good information for us to have as well. We extensively used Sawachi Hisai's Midway Kaisen Kiroku, which is one of the most astonishing pieces of primary source research that I think I've ever seen in my life. Sawachi went out to all of the prefectural governments and she gathered information on every single one of the 3,057 Japanese who were killed during the battle. So if we take a look, for instance, at the roster of the casualties on board the carrier Hiryu, what you see here on these tables, starting at the top, is the name of the individual, their province of birth, their rank at time of death, the number of years and months that they had served in the Navy, their age at the time that they were killed, and in some cases, whether or not they were an aviator, whether they were married, et cetera, et cetera. So what you have here highlighted in red, this is me, you know, finding out, yeah, this has got to be Captain Kaku of the Hiryu. And furthermore, from this sort of information, if you're pig-headed and willing to wade through hundreds of pages worth of this sort of tabulated data, you can do things like find, okay, who was the youngest person who was killed in this battle? And here we have this individual on board the carrier Akagi, who was only 15 years, 8 months old at the time of his death. Likewise, on Soryu, we have a lieutenant commander who was a little over 57. And that allowed us to then translate that raw information into some sort of a narrative passage, you know, actually talking about Tsuchiya Ryosaku and Hodate Ken, who were those two individuals who perished during the battle itself. Anyway, that is very, very useful to trying to build a sense for what was going on in these vessels. Interestingly, too, Sawachi's book contains what I think is the finest record of all of the American casualties as well. You won't find anything like this in any Western book that I've seen, you know, a name-by-name breakdown of all 300 plus of the American casualties. She also then did a fairly interesting job of statistically grinding all of this information. So for instance, if we take a look at the Japanese warships that were attacked during the battle, we see on the top bar there that carrier Akagi went into the fight with 1,630 individuals and she lost 267 crewmen. Kaga, right below her, lost 814 out of her 1,700 plus crewmen. Likewise, she then breaks down statistically that, you know, Akagi represented 8.7% of those total fatalities, et cetera, et cetera. She also took a look at the breakdown by department of the individual ships themselves. So here we have Kaga's casualties broken down for us by department. And that meant that in conjunction with her information showing us that we had a total of 231 engineering casualties on board Kaga, then we can go back to those nominal ship rosters and take a look at the fact that they had a total of 250 engineering crewmen and come up with a real sense for just how grim things were below decks, that in fact Kaga suffered, 9 out of 10 of those men died being trapped below decks. Bottom line though, for all of this stuff is that this is just me doing my level best to take tabulated data and use it to compensate for my weaknesses as a Japanese linguist. And as well, it was impossible for us to really access as much of the Japanese narrative and analysis from Japanese sources, which is of course crucial to what it is that historians do. So, I don't want to play down the amount of effort that we put into doing this, but at the same time, I sometimes feel like what I did was, I don't want to say gimmickry, but it was compensating for my own weaknesses as a Japanese scholar. I was making what I could out of what I had. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about Mitsuo Fuchida as a person and as a myth maker within the Pacific War. As an individual, as a military man, which is really the focus of my interest on him as an individual. He was the air group commander on board the Akagi, which was the flagship at Pearl Harbor. He was also the air group leader for that attack and commanded all 6 aircraft carriers, air groups in the course of that battle. He then went on to participate in all of the early war carrier operations. So Pearl Harbor, the subsequent fighting in the Indian Ocean, and around Java as well. And then, of course, he ends up at Midway. He was, by all accounts, an extremely intelligent, charismatic individual, an excellent leader. He was one of the crucial people before the Pearl Harbor attack who sort of was able to pull together this multi-carrier air group, which had never been done before in naval history, and turn that into one big cohesive attack force. It was a remarkable accomplishment, and Fuchida played a key role in making that happen. And then there's, his role as a myth maker. I mean, this is an individual who wasn't going to let a few facts stand in the way of telling a good war story. And Fuchida is certainly not alone in terms of World War II veterans. I've certainly heard a number of fairly tall tales in my time as an historian. The difference being that Fuchida's war stories were then inserted into the American historical record and amplified out of all proportion to what they actually should have been. He had very little fear of being caught because a great number of the Japanese records had gone up intentionally after the war, had been put to the torch to obfuscate uncomfortable information on the part of the Japanese. And so far as Fuchida knew, there were no official records to implicate him in some of his misstatements. He also was a very good friend of Gordon Prang, who was one of the leading American historians in the immediate post-war era. And so as a result of those interviews that he gave to Prang, he inserted fables, frankly, about Pearl Harbor, Indian Ocean, Midway, etc., that then ended up becoming integral parts of the American account of those battles. And I'd like to, just talk about 2 of those very briefly. First, being Pearl Harbor, and in some ways, I think this is the most pernicious of these various misstatements. That is the mythical fuel tank attack, namely this notion that, gee, if only the Japanese had been smart enough to go after the repair facilities in Pearl Harbor, as well as the fuel tanks within Pearl Harbor, that could have somehow generated a different outcome, prolonged the war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's fairly clear where this myth came from. It came from a series of stills at the end of the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. And here we have Fuchida landing back on the deck of Akagi after the initial attack mission, getting out of his plane, going up to the crew chief and saying, you know, why isn't the next attack wave getting ready to take off? And crew chief is like, well, we haven't been given any orders to that effect. At which point Fuchida looks up at the bridge of Akagi at his buddy Genda. Genda looks down at Fuchida, has a conversation with Admiral Nagumo and says, you know, we can't turn back now. We've got to go back and hit the Americans again, sink their aircraft carriers if we can find them, and, you know, blow up the dry docks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereupon Nagumo responds, Chigao, you're wrong. We've completely accomplished our mission here, and we're going to head home. This war is just beginning, and the safety of this carrier task force is our primary concern at this point in time. At which point the signal flags go up on Akagi that they're retiring, and Fuchida is a very unhappy camper on the deck of Akagi. None of this happened. None of this. This is all a fable. It was completely made up in a series of interviews that Fuchida gave to Gordon Prang during 1963. And Prang, in turn, as the screenwriter, in effect, for Tora, 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 turned around and put that into the screenplay, and it ended up in a movie, and it has now become a part of our national myth around the Pacific War. And as part of the refutation of that, which is fairly lengthy and I won't go into, but I would just like to point out here that Commander Genda, who is the air group, or the air officer of 1st Air Fleet, explicitly in his post-war book comes out and says, this never took place on the bridge of Akagi. I was there the entire time. A proposal for a second wave attack was never made, and I certainly wasn't going to make one, because he knew that Kusaka, Fuchida's right-hand man, and Nagumo, not Fuchida, Nagumo's right-hand man, and Nagumo had both decided before the operation that they were not going to do a follow-up strike. With respect to the Battle of Midway, the most important component of that account that Fuchida inserted was this whole notion about what occurred during the American dive bomber attack around 10:20 in the morning. And when I was growing up as a kid, you know, I had images like this emblazoned in my memory of American Dauntlesses screaming down on Japanese aircraft carriers whose flight decks were packed chock-a-block with aircraft that were just minutes away from taking off to deliver this massive counterstrike against the American forces. And in Fuchida's book, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, he has this beautiful passage called A Fateful 5 Minutes, where he basically puts forward this notion that they had been carrying out preparations during this entire time and were this close to being able to take off when all of a sudden, you know, the Americans come down and snatch it all away. 5 minutes, you know, who would have dreamed that the tide of battle would shift completely in that interval of time? So he created this notion that they were on the cusp of being able to do what they wanted to do. And unfortunately, Fuchida here runs into another set of Japanese primary sources, namely the Kota Choshos, which are the compiled air group records of the Japanese carriers themselves. And I am not going to walk you through the ins and outs of Kota Choshos because but what they give us is an exact breakdown of all the aircraft operations on board this carrier. What planes went up, how many went up, when did they go up, when did they come down, what ordnance was expected or expended, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the material point to keep in mind here as we go through the Kota Choshos is that in order for the Japanese to put together a strike force and get it up on the flight deck, get the engines warmed up, get everything ready to go, that's about a 40-minute operation. And during that time, the entire fantail of the carrier is shut down because we're putting aircraft up there. So there can't be any landings occurring on that aircraft carrier during that 40-minute window. And yet, what we see in the Kodos is a completely different picture. Akagi was bombed shortly after 10:25 in the morning. And yet the Kodo Chosho show us that, as you can see here in the purple highlights, that she landed 3 fighters on her flight deck at 10:10. In other words, just 15 minutes before she was fatally bombed. So the Kodo Choshos just absolutely demolish Fuchida's account at a stroke. And they're transformational in that respect, because many times as historians, we get into these arguments which are more like he said, she said, you know, this guy saw this thing, this guy saw the other thing, who's right? You know, I got to make a call. The Kodo Choshos completely put that on its ear. They basically said, okay, well, if you believe Fuchida's account, you've got to prove my math wrong. Show me how it is that you can get a strike force up on the flight deck and get it completely warmed up in 12 minutes rather than 40. So that was really crucial for establishing the credibility of the work, was demonstrating that it was a different type of problem and couldn't really be reduced to the same sort of source conflicts that you typically see as an historian. So that raises the question that Totani Sensei raised at the beginning of this talk. You know, why wasn't Shattered Sword written earlier than it actually was? Well, as you can see, just from looking at the Kodo Choshos, they're extremely difficult to use. They had been sitting out there on microfilm since shortly after the end of the war, but they're all in this horrible handwritten Japanese. And it took a gentleman who lives in Pennsylvania, a guy named Jim Saruk, who has thousands and thousands of pages of Kodos sitting in his basement, because Jim thinks it is just great fun to be able to track the career of, well, this fighter pilot flew in this unit to start, but then he transferred over here and now he's flying in New Guinea. And so Jim has translated, you know, zillions of pages of these things and very graciously put the Midway Kodos into our hands, but they're super hard to use. I don't know whether Gordon Prang or Donald Goldstein had any idea whether they existed or not. If they did know about them, they certainly didn't have any interest in actually using them. And the other thing was that because Fuchida was giving us the sort of narrative that we wanted as Americans, this sort of, you know, pulling the fat out of the fire at the very last second, you know, cowboys coming in and saving the settlers from the Indians, that sort of narrative played very nicely with our whole notion of what that battle should be. And as a result, I just don't think that there was a lot of inducement on the part of American historians to go looking for other sources that might countermand that narrative. But the bottom line is that Fuchida essentially stopped Western scholarship on the Japanese side of Midway in its tracks for 50 years. Meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, scholarship had moved forward. And it was interesting, as we were getting towards the end of this project and we were becoming aware of some of Fuchida's misstatements, I sent out some letters to historians that I had gotten to know through the process. And I was very delicate in approaching this topic because, so far as I knew, Fuchida was still a war hero in Japan. And the last thing I wanted to be doing was, you know, apparently bad-mouthing a war hero. So I'm asking very discreet questions. You know, we're seeing some discrepancies here in Fuchida's account. Can you help me understand what's going on, et cetera, et cetera? Letters go out, letters come back. The first one that comes back is this one from Hyodo Nisohachi. And the first words out of his mouth are, to tell why Fuchida's book contains transparent lies. My jaw absolutely hit the ground when I read that. It was just, it was so in your face. And Nisohachi then ended by saying, you know, if Fuchida's book is one of the few books available on the Battle of Midway that has been translated into English, it's a funny story. In other words, where have you guys been? You know, we have known since at least the mid-1970s when Senshi Sosho came out that Fuchida's account was completely non-credible, and so were those of other officers such as Kusaka. So the Japanese had outstripped us in terms of Midway scholarship by, you know, 25, 30 years. What are the motivations then of Mitsuo Fuchida? What's going on here? And I think it's very dangerous for me as a Westerner to try to look into the mind of an individual who is several generations removed from me and part of a very different culture. But my nutshell psychology, you know, analysis says the following things. I think that Fuchida was an incredibly complex individual. And I think that he was motivated, as Totani Sensei mentioned, by a collective need to justify the actions at Midway and to make First Air Fleet, the losers in this battle, look better, or at least as good as they could look. And Tony and I both think in terms of there being sort of a loose cabal of First Air Fleet officers, because you got to remember, if you've lost 4 aircraft carriers in an afternoon, when you go home to Tokyo afterwards, there's going to be a little splaining that has to go on, okay? And so I think it was much easier for these individuals to come up with a story that basically went along the lines of, man, we were this close. We were this close. And then the gods of war just came down and took it all away from us, rather than pointing fingers of individual blame at people, at least at people who were still alive. Because of course, after the war is over, Nagumo is dead, Yamamoto is dead. So this allowed Fuchida to then create this account. I really think of him as sort of the front man of the band, if you will, of this group of First Air Fleet officers. He puts his account out there immediately, and that gives him what I would, you know, define as sort of a first mover advantage. The other thing that's going on with Fuchida, I speculate, is that immediate post-war Japan was a time of great social flux, and there was a lot of opportunity for people to reinvent themselves in ways that would not have been possible before the war. Fuchida's career had been destroyed when the Navy that he served was likewise destroyed. He comes home and he's a dirt farmer and he hates it. And he ends up, you know, converting to Christianity. And I don't know anything about that conversion in terms of its legitimacy or what have you. All I know is that in the course of doing that, Fuchida transforms himself into a role that is much more applicable to his personal gifts of storytelling, of being charismatic, of being able to connect with people, and creates for himself a new life that was much better than the one that he had. So now to just kind of talk about, you know, where I kind of think we're at and where I think we're going. First of all, in terms of the current state of things, I think it's expected that if you're going to be writing a book on the Pacific War, that you need to at least try to use Japanese sources as much as possible. So for instance, if you're going to be writing on the Burma campaign, you got to bring in Grant and Tamayama's Burma 1942 because Tamayama is using Japanese sources. Same thing in the Kokoda campaign. You know, we got to access those books that have dragged in Japanese sources as well, including Stephen Ballard's excerpts from the Senshi Sosho period. Don Ken likewise gets into 5th Sentai's records during the Battle of Java Sea, and that's an extremely valuable contribution to the record. To this should also be added, I think, Chinese sources, Indian sources, who are both active belligerents. And then, of course, there are a lot of sort of completely unsung voices in the occupied regions, Vietnamese voices, Malaysian voices, Indonesian, et cetera, who could be added into this mix as well. And I do think that you're starting to see more of a trend towards multilateralism. I think Rich Frank's Tower of Skulls is an excellent example of that sort of thing. And I would expect that to continue in the future. To me, however, sort of the irreducible foundation of this needs to be Senshi Sosho. You know, we have the German official histories in English now. Why don't we have the Japanese? To this point, only 3 of the 100+ volumes have been translated into English. The 2 volumes having to do with the Dutch East Indies, and then the Australian portions of Japanese Army operations in the South Pacific. There are also private translations of Senshi Sosho running around out there. John Lundstrom has the Coral Sea volume in a typewritten format I've seen excerpts from. As a technologist myself, you know, I've made my living as an IT director for the last 30 years or so. I do think that there are some real potential opportunities happening in technology. You know, this shows you a screen cap of me pointing my camera using Google Translate on a page of that Kojin Shaw Carriers volume. And actually the thing that it spat out was really fairly credible. Unfortunately, if you point that same phone at Senshi Sosho, you don't get anywhere near as good a result, because Senshi Sosho was written in a much more academic, old style Japanese and is not as amenable to machine translation, unfortunately. But I do look to technology to give us more mechanisms for translations. I further think that there is an opportunity here for pointing more data-oriented tools at the story, the study of this war. And I'll give you an example of that. If you take a look at my website, it is now primarily a repository for track records of movements of Japanese warships. So a lot of researchers use these TROMs to go in and see, okay, where was this warship on date X? Who is it operating with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wish that I were a good enough database programmer to take my site to the next level, but I want to show you an example of what that would look like. And that is Gudmundur Helgeson's U-boat.net, which has been around for as long as my website has been around. That is to say the mid-1990s. Gudmundur's site is absolutely jaw-dropping. So for instance, if I want to take a look at some of the convoy battles here in the North Atlantic, let's look at convoy SC7. Gudmundur gives us a breakdown of when that convoy occurred and shows us all of the ships that were either damaged or sunk during the course of that battle. He uses geospatial data to build in a track of the convoy's movements. You can drill down into the ships that were sunk. So here's a picture of one of the vessels that was sunk there. It gives us all the particulars of that vessel, where it was actually sunk, and in some cases gives us detailed information on the people that were on that vessel as well. I can drill into the submarine that sank the Trevisa, look at when it was launched, when it was sunk, where it was sunk, what were the casualties. Unfortunately, in this case, all 53 hands lost. I can lateral over to the commanders of that boat. And if I want to, I can take a look at Johann Mohr, who was one of the more successful German aces. His total career sinkings, when he was born, when he died, all of his war patrols, each individual ship that he sank during those war patrols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're doing any sort of work on the Battle of the North Atlantic, you would be a fool not to use U-boat.net, because it gives us a density and interconnection of information that we simply can't get out of any sort of a book, even some of the more dense works like Clay Blair's U-boat War. I really think that we need more of that thing in the Pacific, and we certainly have the necessary data to be putting into these databases to use ship movements, kamikaze attack locations. We could be building text databases and pouring unit records and war diaries and that sort of thing in as well. Even mundane things like logistical records, if you threw big data techniques at these things, I bet you would learn some really interesting things. So the bottom line for me is that there's still plenty to learn about in the Pacific War. And I look forward to seeing, the scholarship that continues to come out on this war in the next 20 years. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Parshall. I'd like to remind Zoom participants that we are accepting questions. Please use our Q&A function to post your questions. Now I would like to introduce our third speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Richard Frank, an international renowned author and expert on the Pacific War. After graduating from the University of Missouri, Mr. Frank was commissioned in the US Army, in which he served for nearly 4 years. His military service included a tour of duty in South Vietnam of the Republic of Vietnam as an aero rifle platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division. He completed studies at the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, DC. His first significant contribution to the field of military history was the 1990 publication titled Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle. This massive book of 800 pages, which provide an exhaustive study of the critical campaign in the South Pacific, is of special relevance to the symposium today, for it was the first of its kind that made use of the Japanese War History series, Senshi Sosho, alongside newly declassified US radio intelligence for the purpose of reconstructing the Battle of Guadalcanal, and to do so from the contrasting perspectives of the two battling nations. Mr. Frank's next major publication in 1999, titled Downfall, the End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, similarly draws upon diverse sources to reconstruct in meticulous detail the circumstances of the war in the last months, which culminated in the Japanese leadership's final decision on August 14, 1945, to accept surrender to the Allied powers. This landmark publication helped put to rest the ongoing controversies on historical causation and counterfactuals regarding the final days of the war. This book received in 2000 the Harry S. Truman Book Award. Mr. Frank is currently undertaking a new book project on World War II in Asia and the Pacific, which will result in a trilogy. The first volume, Tower of Skulls, A History of the Asia-Pacific War, Volume 1, July 1937 to May 1942, was published by W.W. Norton just this year. In his presentation today, Mr. Frank will share with us some of the key arguments and findings that he has made in Tower of Skulls regarding the Japanese military actions preceding as well as in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. His presentation is titled Rags to Riches, the Historiography of the Asia-Pacific War. Mr. Frank?
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. And once again, I want to thank the Hoover Institution for permitting me to participate in this panel. I want to thank also my panelists, Dr. Spector and John Parshall, my good friend. What I really wanted to talk about today is this evolution that Dr. Spector talked about over 80 years of our understanding or lack of understanding or misunderstanding of what I believe should be called the Asia-Pacific War. And let me start with, I think, a fundamental observation. It's trite to say that journalism is the first draft of history, but I think in terms of what we're talking about today, it has an important dimension that really endures. I've been reading the New York Times day by day through World War II starting in 1937, when the war, in my view, erupts in China. The Times printed very shrewd domestic and international news and war coverage. And especially notable feature as a paper of record was that they would publish the official war communiques of all the major combatants each day on page 2. The Times also accompanied these sometimes with very helpful maps. The front section, especially the front page, conveyed an immediate sense of how the top line daily news and images of the war marched past the American people. The American elites routinely read the New York Times, and it provided the template that was followed in many other media outlets for the day's news. In 1942, the top line contents conveyed a very powerful message that the outcome of the war remained perilously contingent. Ultimate Allied triumph dangled in doubt until the last 3 months of the war. And even then, the war promised to be long, costly, and really a decisive outcome still uncertain. And I start with this observation because I think it reveals to me a very fundamental and troubling aspect about the subsequent development of historiography. For going on now to 8 decades, we usually have called this non-European phase of the war the Pacific War, but that was primarily a maritime war across the Pacific from December 1941 to 1945, with 2 major protagonists, Imperial Japan and the United States. American allies, Australia and New Zealand, earned some attention in the coverage, as does the mention of the Commonwealth of the Philippines, which is an important battleground at the beginning and towards the end of what's called the Pacific War. But in my view, this narrative framework gives scant mention to an area I call the Arc of Asia. And that's a span that in 1937 ran from India at that point, east across China and Japan, and southeast to what's now Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies. And in that entire span, there were literally about 1 billion human beings living. And this was of the total world population at that time, which was estimated to be about 2.3 billion people. India and China, by combination, total about 75% of that total 1 billion. Now, this Arc of Asia is where the non-European part of the war harvested about 80% of the deaths, what I think we should more accurately call the Asia-Pacific War. And that total in the Asia-Pacific War of about 20 million deaths in that area in the Arc of Asia was of a grand total of about 25 million deaths in the whole war. And 20 million dead is also roughly about 1/3 of all the deaths in what we call World War II. Another basic fact is that roughly American effort in World War II divided almost exactly 2-to-1 to the European phase of the war over the Asia-Pacific phase. That's illustrated in American battle lists, which divide almost exactly in that portion. Now, in addition to that, the massive Lend-Lease program was skewed even more decisively towards the European phase of the war. That's my first point about the post-war historiography, is that unlike contemporary coverage from the New York Times, or what we know now about, and what we know about the division of American efforts during World War II, the current historiography, at least for most of 80 years, tended to omit or obscure the full scale, geographical extent, and the vast human cost of this non-European part of the war. But if you read the Times coverage of that period, you were fully aware that this non-European part of the war was huge and vital. So how did we arrive at this situation? Was it due to the deficiencies of academic or popular historians, or were they basically struggling with factors beyond their control? I suggest the following, that the answer is sort of a combination of both. Wartime reporting created the earliest narratives, and they generally reflected the broad tides of the war, but often failed to record accurately strategic or operational or tactical details. And this stemmed primarily from the lack of what we call the other side of the hill, or the enemy, as we would call it, side of the story. It also tended to clearly reflect a nationalist bias. And historians certainly overcome this, these distortions from these issues with access to the records of all the adversaries. But there rested a formidable obstacle in achieving this satisfactory history of the Asia-Pacific War after the end of the war. The available critical sources for decades after the war that were very limited, distorted, or the history that was produced in that period. Immediately after the war, the controversial attack on Pearl Harbor produced a massive and massively publicized joint congressional hearing. This generated an enormous 40-volume record of testimony and documents. It's a trove that touched areas well outside of the Pearl Harbor attack. And the hearings produced sensational headlines about U.S. success against Japanese diplomatic codes, thus confirming some earlier leaks that hinted at important U.S. success against Japanese codes. And for those involved in the super secret realm of communications intelligence, including code breaking, this was a disaster. The success in this area had been a key to Allied success during the war, and it beckoned as an invaluable tool in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. In retrospect, however, what is really remarkable is how these revelations did not lead to a far more extensive release of code-breaking information for 3 decades plus. Now, a multitude of official U.S. records from the service departments, as well as civilian agencies, became available, as well as some memoirs of major participants shortly after the war. And these sources basically provided the foundation for sets of official U.S. histories. And by international standards, I would say that those U.S. histories are amazingly comprehensive and remarkably candid. What is interesting in this context is that while trained historians produce the histories of the Army Air Force, and the U.S. Marine Corps under the auspices of each service, the U.S. Navy never sponsored an official history. Instead, President Franklin Roosevelt had issued a special commission to award-winning Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morison for a history of U.S. naval operations in World War II. Morison was at considerable pains to insist that he stood independent of the Navy, and he was not an official, as he put it, a hired historian. Now, Morison's work remains foundational, and he did include Japanese source material, including interviews he conducted with his assistants. In 15 volumes, including a master index published between 1947 and 1962, Morison turned out an immense, very readable body of work of high quality and insight. Now, the one systematic shortcoming in Morison's work was really not his fault. The Navy permitted no breach in the supreme secrecy surrounding radio intelligence information for Morison to use publicly. Now, there's some perhaps hints in the text at places that Morison knew of the ultra secret, but no open discussion. It's also been faulted somewhat for being a little too terse on logistics. The U.S. Navy proved distinctive in another way. While the other services handed over original official records to the National Archives within a fairly reasonable period after the war, the Navy did not fully hand over its collection until 1995. Even then, the Navy did not release the war diary of Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean areas. It's also known as the Gray Book, the shorthand from a title it had during the war. This is the single most important source on the Navy's role against Japan and a role in the war against Japan. It has finally been published online in 2012. Now, Dr. Spector, and we've had some earlier references to Sensei Shosho, which is absolutely a vital source of information. The early American histories, including Morison's effort and some quality academic and popular works, which were published in the 1970s, were based on the Japanese records that were generated primarily during the occupation, and Professor Titania referred to those. President Roosevelt also commissioned the Strategic Bombing Survey to study bombing during the war, and this produced an important trove of documents, interviews, as well as statistical data, some of which is still extremely useful. But there was really no really solid Japanese basis for the war. This finally was overtaken with the publication of Sensei Shosho, or War History Series. Eventually, as mentioned, this totaled 102 volumes published between 1966 and 1980. And since 2014, it's been published online by the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo. And as mentioned, the primary authors of this series were former Imperial Army and Imperial Navy officers who normally participated in the events that they were describing. Now, in my view, there were two features about Sensei Shosho that set it apart from Western histories. The first is the inclusion of verbatim or nearly verbatim key orders and sometimes reports. And these can take a reader down into really minute detail that would never appear in Western publications. The Japanese cultural affinity for diary keeping is an important additional source that they had available. This often permits very candid and direct personal insights into the thinking interaction of Japanese leaders, which are much less commonly found in Western official histories. Another distinctive feature of the series involves the printed Japanese characters. During the occupation of Japan, one of the far-reaching reforms was a simplified version of written Japanese. And the main text of Sensei Shosho is written in this post-war Japanese characters. But the quotations that are contained in Sensei Shosho appear in the older style characters. It's literally visible on the printed page because of the very much greater density of those characters. And Japanese who've been educated since the end of the war typically encounter challenges to extract a nuanced and meaning of the older characters just on sight, whatever here. It's not nearly a straightforward process. And that partly, I think, explains what John was referring to about the difficulties of machine use of translations. Now, one important criticism of the series is that it's uneven. The volumes I've worked with a translator on who knew the older characters also on the Solomon Islands battles and also the end stage of the war, those were all excellent history, very high quality. The volumes about the war in China have been particularly criticized as being overly biased and not reliable. One feature of Sensei Shosho that especially stands out, because of Japan's position in the hub of events in the Pacific and Asia, it stood as really the only comprehensive account of the entire Asia-Pacific War for decades. Now, another huge step in the whole course of the development of historiography was radio intelligence disclosures. Although several earlier works had mentioned or hinted at the breaking of Japanese code, German codes and ciphers, German codes and ciphers, the 1974 publication of F.W. Winterbotham's The Ultra Secret confirmed and extended upon the stunning story of the penetration of German codes and ciphers by a massive Allied intelligence organization. The account, however, focused on Germany, and as noted earlier, American success against Japanese diplomatic ciphers became public knowledge as early as 1945. And there were subsequent indications of American success against Japanese naval codes, particularly relating to the Battle of Midway and the shoot down of the aircraft bearing Yamamoto in 1943. But the extent of American success against Japanese diplomatic and naval codes and ciphers remained behind a wall of secrecy for decades after the war. As far as I understand it, also, we only had a few hints there have been any significant break-ins with respect to Imperial Army codes and ciphers. And this was due to a combination of circumstances. That was primarily because there was a lack of intercept of a sufficient volume of messages to permit an effective attack on the code and cipher system, and also because the Imperial Army had taken superior security measures to keep their codes and ciphers, make them more unbreakable than their naval counterparts had achieved. In fact, we learned a number of years ago the stunning story of how the Imperial Army apparently had come to believe that the Allies had made major break-ins in Imperial Navy codes, but the Army failed to notify their counterparts about their conclusions. Now, Winterbotham's work soon promoted the release of a cascade of records on Allied penetration of codes and ciphers of all three Axis powers, and these massive archival collections began appearing from 1975. They sort of peaked within the next 20 years, but they've continued to some degree since. And most number of commentators immediately pronounced that the release of this information would cause sort of this fundamental and total rewrite of all the history about the Asia-Pacific War. But the historiography, the work by historians soon demonstrated this was not such a simple process. One facet of the disclosures that soon proved to be as important as the records relating directly to radio intelligence was that you had to be able to demonstrate not only what the radio intelligence products were, but how those products had actually fit into Allied decision-making on strategic, operational, and tactical areas. And we learned here that the secrecy surrounding radio intelligence products had also enforced secrecy concerning a great deal of other records that simply discussed radio intelligence. And it soon became obvious that the existence of intelligence by itself proved little if it could not be linked to Allied decisions or actions. And so these messages, war diaries, and other papers documenting the decisions that talked about radio intelligence proved an indispensable link between the raw intelligence and actual results. Now, we also learned, interestingly enough, that one of the other things that occurred in this whole massive attack on Japanese codes and ciphers was that the various facilities that were conducting these attacks by no means were always in total agreement about what the meaning was of various messages. There's a whole sub-story about the conflicts within the radio intelligence producers about what the intelligence showed. Now, let me give a hat tip to Professor Spector, because I remember this very well, and it comes right exactly at the midpoint of what we're talking about. In 1985, he was asked to write a commentary on the historiography of what we then called the Pacific War. I believe it was for the Washington Post. And he observed at that time, much the same thing he commented about today, that the existing literature at that point resembled a barbell in profile. And that was the analogy he used. He said there was a large concentration about events at the beginning of the war relating to Pearl Harbor, and another dense concentration about events in 1945, particularly including the atomic bomb. And in between, by comparison, the coverage was relatively thin. And that was entirely true as far as I was concerned. And it was interesting to me because I was then working on my book about the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. And certainly everything I knew at that time was fully in accord with Dr. Spector's analysis. Now, there had been a number of quality works that had been turned out. It's not like it was a complete desert. I particularly would note, without going into lengthy detail, I always thought Christopher Thorne's Allies of a Kind, that was published in 1975, which, if not the first work, it was clearly a strong beacon towards the examination of race and racism and the conduct of the entire war. Now, fortunately, over the decades after 1985, we really witnessed what I believe is a flourishing of good accounts about the middle parts of the war. And I could cite many examples, but John Lundstrom's already been mentioned. He integrated Japanese source material into a very deep dive in US Navy records. And in my view, he rewrote the story not only of the battles he talked about directly, but the whole US Navy command in the first year after Pearl Harbor. And again, I would give another salute to John Parshall and Andrew Tully for their Shattered Sword, which really is just a model of creating a fully balanced account from both sides of the Battle of Midway. And Dr. Spector struck again with his work on the Ruins of Empire in 2007. That was about the effects of the Asia-Pacific War after 1945. And this is now a part of a very large and growing library that examines in detail the post-war effects of the struggle between 1937 and 1945. Now, in those 80 years, I would say that the largest single hole in the historiography was an accurate record account of what the Chinese called the War of Resistance from 1937 to 1945. After defeat in the Civil War in China in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the rump of his Nationalist Party installed themselves on Taiwan, and Mao Zedong became the supreme leader of China in Beijing. And during Mao's reign, which extended to 1976, although commemoration of the War of Resistance did not cease, it was subordinated to the saga of the revolution, the Civil War, and the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party and Mao. Chiang died in 1975, Mao died the following year. And after an interval, there was in the People's Republic of China first an explosion of personal memoirs of people who had lived through the War of Resistance. And this signaled to the leadership sought to place the War of Resistance in a more important position in Chinese history and Chinese public history. Sensing a new opening and room for more candor about the War of Resistance, Chinese historians began to publicize archival holdings, and these would eventually disseminate to the West. And this release promised and did deliver on a major revision and reassessment of Mao and the Chinese Communist Party and the War of Resistance. Then in an absolutely hugely important event, Chiang Kai-shek's personal diaries were released from Taiwan, and they have been since 2006 at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And in my view, it's hard to overstate the importance of Chiang's diaries because they contradicted a great deal of the prior and generally critical to very critical literature about Chiang as China's leaders through the War of Resistance. And one very unexpected offshoot of this, that it took me quite a while to believe this after I was first told this, that Chiang became a respected figure among many Chinese, even in the People's Republic of China, which would have been unthinkable between 1949 and well into the 1990s. Now, a key example of this sea change in scholarly views about China's war of resistance was Harvard Professor Jay Taylor's biography of Zhang, Generalissimo, published in 2009. While not overlooking Zhang's many mistakes and misjudgments, it provided a refreshing and even-handed account and depiction of Zhang's participation in the war of resistance. Another thread in the evolving historiography about the Second World War, which really has come to the fore over the years, is that for the first several decades after the war, we had a framework internationally, really, of history sort of from the top down. Top leaders, the big events, and this clearly dominated the accounts. And now, since the last 40 years or so, we have increasingly had an emphasis on the war looking up from below and giving the personalized account of what the war was like and what it meant to the participants at the time. Let me finish up with talking about what I call the itches, which is sort of, where I think the historiography is going and should go. And I want to refer primarily to what I think are the gaps that I believe most clearly need address. Number one, I think we still have an enormous amount of additional detail about China that we need to know, both the nationalists, the communists, and those who were in between. A particularly sensitive topic in this area is collaboration. We know that in Europe, it took decades before the Europeans began to grapple, I think, realistically with the subject of collaboration during the German occupation, because it was such a painful topic. And much the same applies to China, and perhaps in the current environment, maybe even more so to talk about that. Number two, I think much more work needs to be done in areas occupied by Japan, like John referred to, the Burma, Indonesia, Indochina, just a whole raft of countries in the Asia-Pacific region that have a story that's very much connected to the Asia-Pacific War, typically in terms of how they eventually gained their sovereignty or how that shaped the nation states that they now are. Number three, the archives on radio intelligence still contain areas that have been insufficiently or never adequately exploited. And number four, there's still a large mass of Japanese historiography covering many aspects of the military, political, and economic aspects about the war that still has not been integrated into Western work. And you'll notice that much of what I said correlates to what Dr. Spector and John Parshall commented upon today. So we have now, in my view, a very radically different view of the historiography of the Asia-Pacific War than existed for decades after the end of the war, but we still have a pretty far distance to go. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. Now we are entering the Q&A session. Let me begin this session by me asking a question each of our speakers to clarify some issues. And then we go dive into a list of questions that are now piling up. So first to Professor Spector, in your presentation, you pointed out that there is a widening gap between the scholarly achievements in researching and writing about the history of World War II in Asian Pacific on the one hand, and the popular understanding of the same war on the other hand. How do we close this gap? Or is it necessary to close this gap? And I'm assuming you would say yes, in which case, which part of the gap, which aspect of the gap do you consider urgently needing of closing?
Well, I would say that basically a lot of the successful works that we discussed today do have a broad appeal to the public, but they just don't have the blockbuster appeal that some of the popular works by journalists, and most of them concerning the war in Europe, have. So I think the historians, both academic historians and other historians, have done a good job on the war, and there's still a lot of interesting material to exploit now. I think that the big change probably is the growing recognition that as Professor Frank has pointed out, that the war didn't just take place. It wasn't just the island hopping campaigns of MacArthur and Nimitz in the Pacific. It's not just the big naval battles. I remember that when I wrote Eagle Against the Sun after it was published, I met a number of academics from different countries in Southeast Asia and India and so on, and they all said, "Oh yes, we're very interested in our country. We're very interested in the history of World War II." And my idea was, "Oh yeah, World War II. Well, that's these battles in the Pacific." That's not at all what they were talking about. They were talking about the experience of their country in World War II. And in many ways, it was a decisive period in their national history. And that's where the interest lies, not necessarily in campaigns and battles. And one interesting thing that I found in my subsequent research was that the way collaboration was regarded in different countries. In Korea, in places like Korea, political opponents would accuse each other of having collaborated with the Japanese. In places like Indonesia and Indochina, especially in Indonesia, whether you collaborated or not, it didn't make a lot of difference, because the nationalists were always in touch with each other. They always knew what the other side was doing, and they were both working towards the same end. And in the same way, in Indochina, whether you'd been in the puppet Bao Dai government set up by the Japanese or not, didn't really matter, as long as you were against the French and you were willing to follow the Viet Minh, and that's okay. So that the collaboration was regarded differently in different countries and that was one of the major issues in post-war Southeast Asia, and then of course in post-war China, collaboration was used as a political tool, both the nationalist side and the communist. Each side is accusing the other of being composed of former collaborationists.
I would like to invite Mr. Pasha and Mr. Frank as well to respond to this question, the growing gap between the scholarly research on World War II on the one hand and the popular perception or understanding of World War II. If you have anything to comment on this, I welcome you to this.
I just mentioned in this, knowing the trends in the academy, which is much more global in orientation, I think one thing that's important that you can seize upon in teaching the Asia-Pacific War is that what happened in that period, particularly in Asia, was very fundamental to the whole evolution there. We went from a massive number of colonies into all these independent sovereign nations. And in my view, the single most important part of that was I believe, and my authority for this is Mao Zedong himself, who said basically if the Japanese had not intervened for that extended war in China, the Chinese communists very likely would not have triumphed by 1949. In fact, it's just astonishing where they were in 1937 and where the Chinese communists, both political and military, was by 45 and then on into 49. So to understand the war is not just this narrow US and Japan across the Pacific, but as something that's fundamental globally to the world we live in right down to the 21st century.
Then now I'd like to put one question to you, Mr. Basho, for clarification. I'm really impressed by your command of the Japanese language, actually, despite your transcripts, whatever the transcripts tell us. But you did point out the difficulty of capturing the narrative, the stories being told in Japanese accounts of the war. But I understand you did try to compensate that difficulty by, say, showing your manuscript to Professor Mark Peaty, those individuals who have the command of the language and so on. Could you comment on that, how you grapple with this particular problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Tony and I both benefited from the fact that sort of the review committee for Shattered Sword comprised what I would describe as kind of a murderer's row of prominent Pacific War historians. Yes, Mark Peaty, who obviously was an absolutely superlative Japanese scholar, looked at it. Osamu Tagaya also took a look at it. Bob Cressman, John Lundstrom, and I'm sure I'm forgetting several other people. But the end result of that was that they having shot holes in it and I having repaired those holes, we're reasonably confident then that if we go out to the marketplace that we're going to be relatively well armored against other critics. And that sort of raises a broader issue, I think, within the historical community today, in that it is no longer possible, because of the money structure within the publishing industry, for publishing houses to put the kind of resources behind authors that they used to receive in terms of editorial support and so forth. And as a result, I think a lot of the books that come out of the mill today reflect that, and that their scholarship in many cases is not as good as it would have been had those authors received the proper supports. You know, I guess I benefited from the fact that I'm pretty good at making friends and also, you know, trading favors. You know, can you read my book? I'll draw you some maps, you know, and the result was that Shattered Sword was a more collaborative effort, I think, in some respects than a lot of books were, and it really paid off.
I would like to put the same question to Professor Spector and Dr. Frank as well. When using foreign language sources, not just to the Japanese language, how did you handle some issues you may have encountered with translating and transplanting the knowledge arising from these foreign language sources?
Yes, well, I have a terrible time with primary sources in Asian languages because I don't, I got to the point once where I could actually recognize some file names in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives. That was as sophisticated as I got. I was very lucky, though, being at George Washington. We have a large number of Asian students and students of Asian background. So I was always able to recruit very talented translators. The only problem was they tended to graduate. And so I'd have to start all over again. But it's hard when you're using translators, especially those who don't necessarily know that a division is bigger than a battalion and things like that. And they also don't they don't have an idea of what historians necessarily are looking for. But I'd say in general, I was very fortunate that I had that I was at GWN. I'm in the East Asia Center and in the School of International Relations. So that was a big help. I also had the great good fortune. I happened to be in graduate school with Asada Sadao, who was one of the first Japanese historians trained in the U.S. after the war. He was a superstar in Japanese in the history of World War II in Japan. And he would actually sit and translate some books for me. It was it was not a very systematic process. He would say, look what Captain so-and-so says here. You better take this down. So it was not at all systematic, but I was very fortunate that he introduced me to sort of the inner workings of the Japanese Navy and rivalries and so on, at a time that wasn't very well understood by American historians of the war.
Thank you. Mr. Frank?
My first two books, Downfall and Guadalcanal, I worked with a translator, Benichi Osaka. Like I mentioned earlier, he was trained, went to school before 1945, and he was also a technical translator. So he could read both types of characters or whatever here. Also, he with very little instruction, he could do divisions, battalions, or destroyers, cruisers, or whatever it was. He handled that very quickly or whatever here. Had a very strong sense. And he literally, when I was doing this, and I was paying myself to do this, I'd sit on one side of a table, he'd sit on the other. He would sight read page after page, and I would take it down in my style. That's how I work. Now, basically what has happened from that is that I've sort of parlayed that into this a collaborative network. And John, I know, has been sort of the same situation, right? You make friends with people who can read fluently the language, know the history, know military history or whatever you need to know. And what I've been doing with Tower of Skulls, because the span of it is so enormous, is I've been using a lot of my colleagues all across the globe to guide me into what I need to look at, to review the manuscript and make sure I haven't done something that's really going to get me into deep censure or whatever here. Of course, the interpretive part is my own or whatever here, but that's sort of where we are. And I think that is a growing feature of how we do history of the Asia Pacific War.
Thank you.
I might add that we're all of a certain age, and the next generation of scholars are going to be multilingual. We see them, I see them all the time come through our graduate school, and they're in many other graduate schools. There's a small group called, I think it's called the Chinese Military History Society. And that group is entirely bilingual, and so it's a good thing that I retired a few years ago, because otherwise I would be put out to pasture anyway by these better trained younger historians.
And I'd like to pose one question to Mr. Frank. As you have laid out in your presentation, there are not Japanese language sources, but there is a body of literature in Chinese language as well as others. My question, or rather that I would like to put to you for clarification, is how do you juggle with those diverse sources? How did you, in your latest publication, Tower of Skulls? I mean, you have, your publications are just so amazing for the sheer mental stamina you have in absorbing and digesting and putting them out to produce an amazing narrative. But now you have a trilogy, and just this first volume itself is already quite massive and making use of diverse sources. So if you have any tips as to how to juggle those diverse sources to tell small and big stories, we'd like to hear a little bit of that.
Well, you know, it's training. I think my training as a lawyer was enormously helpful to me. Lawyers who deal with witnesses and documents. It teaches you about testimony, human recollection, and factors like that, which are invaluable when you're trying to assess sources of whatever language or nationality you're dealing with. And like I said, I benefit, particularly in the project I'm on now, by having this network that basically helps guide me to what, you know, are really important themes. And then my job is really to integrate that and to bring in a depth on particularly the American dimension of it, the Western dimension of it, whatever here. And that's what I do. And a lot of what we really do now, at least in my experience, is you're sort of in this market trading of I bring this to the market and someone else brings something else, and you collaborate and put it together, and then a lot of informal discussion about things, and you run into a lot of issues where you're thrashing around to decide what to believe in. Of course, in many cases, you get these really dramatic clashes of sources. It's especially notable about Japanese and Chinese sources, for instance. So that's the best answer I can give.
Thank you. I'd like to put the same question to Professor Spector and Mr. Basho, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I'd just amplify that. The project I've been working on personally for the last dozen years is a new history of the year 1942. And so I'm looking at all the theaters in the war, and that's a lot to bite off. One of the things that's happening in terms of how I'm approaching the work is that it's very iterative and in some cases circular in nature. I'm currently in my third rewrite in 8 years of my Eastern Front narrative based on new scholarship that's come out both from the Soviet Union and from people like David Stahel, who speaks German and puts out wonderful books. And I think you have to come to peace with the fact that the scholarship continues moving, even if your book project isn't, and you need to be able to be flexible enough to say, I got to go back, you know, there's a new source here that I've got to retrofit some stuff in there, and in some cases completely pull apart a narrative that already had been done in light of that new scholarship. That's just the nature of the beast.
Thank you. Then I'd like to thank the Zoom participants for posting questions. We're gonna go through your questions for the rest of the time that we have. The first question, this is directed to Mr. Basho. Are the fabrications of Fuchida, however personally understandable or justified, not a direct affront to the memory of Nagumo?
And I'll give a wave to my friend Jim Dingman here and from New York City. Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that Tony and I tried to do in Shattered Sword was, I don't want to say rehabilitate the reputation of Nagumo, who I don't think was a terribly gifted commander necessarily, but to at least point out the limitations of the doctrinal framework that Nagumo had to operate within, and to paint him at least a little more sympathetically in terms of how he conducted the battle, and illustrate that he actually made command decisions that were reasonably congruent with the information that he had in hand and the doctrine that he had to work within. I think that then what ends up happening, as I mentioned, Nagumo is dead. And so he's a very convenient fall guy for people like Fuchida and Kusaka to point fingers of blame at, because he was in no position to defend himself.
Next question is also to you, Mr. Basho. Can you please comment about the book by Captain Hara called Japanese Destroyer Captain?
Tamaichi Hara's book is still a wonderful read. I have some skepticism regarding whether or not Hara was actually as integral to the development of Japanese torpedo doctrine as he claims within the book. But I think in terms of it providing a firsthand account of the actions that he was involved in, which were numerous, it remains a very usable and useful source. Rich, do you have any comments on that?
I second what you said. I think the other thing you have to bear in mind is when you're talking about anyone reporting their experiences in combat, which is very chaotic, you have to be very tempered in your judgment about this is what this person believes they observed at the time. This is not, you don't assume that they just made this stuff up or whatever here. And even though it may conflict with a lot of other records or whatever here, when you're looking at these really narrow windows that anyone is looking through when they're actually in combat, then you have to understand that that's what's going on here. And you don't, with this spectacular example of Fuchida in mind, to the contrary or whatever here, everyone is usually trying to pretty much tell the story the way they remember it, with the caveat that most human beings tend to have a very generous view of their own conduct.
Our next question is for the panel as a whole, from James Smith, amateur historian. Mr. Pasha brought out a good point on use of technology. How can technologies like virtual reality be used to help tell the stories to the masses?
I don't know that I have a cogent answer regarding virtual reality, but I'll tell you that recently I was in a conversation with Eric Bergerud, who's another very good Pacific War historian, and his observation was all the action in history these days is happening on YouTube. And you know, I operate in that medium fairly successfully as a guest on various YouTube broadcasts, and I'd simply point out there's a gentleman in the UK who goes by the name of Drakeniefel, who runs a YouTube channel devoted to naval history that has over 250,000 subscribers. And he churns out very high quality content, and he also brings, you know, guests on as well. He has a tremendous impact on this field. He moves the needle because he has so many viewers. I went and did a Midway related Q&A with him and got 70,000 views within 3 days. It's astonishing. And that points to the importance, I think, of visual medium in general. I mean, the reason that Fuchida is so important to us in the Pacific is because his tale is embedded in Tora, Tora, Tora. And as much as I, you know, might delude myself that my book has remained in print for 15 years, the fact is that millions of people have seen Tora, 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 and that represents millions more people than will ever read my book. So those sorts of mediums, I think, are incredibly important in terms of influencing how people perceive history.
You know, I just add to what John said is, I mean, in a sort of an ideal view of how all of this is going to develop, I think the visual element of it is really critical. I know I'm associated with the World War II Museum, and the visual element that we use here is really critical to telling the story. It's simple and comprehensible by most everyone. And the virtual reality element of it now, what you can do with that, what you can do with the technology in terms of recreating CGI and things over here, I think it's a very useful tool in the sense that it will get people to look at something that they otherwise would not look at. And once you bring them in, you might be able to give them some history along the way or whatever here, how you package it and deliver it. And that's essentially, I don't think that means that because you work that in that method that you're diluting necessarily the quality. I think you're enormously multiplying the accessibility and the spread of that technology.
Professor Spector?
Yeah, well, I was impressed by what Jonathan said about some of the sources that he uses that lend themselves very well to studies of big data. And the really trendy thing to be in nowadays in academia is digital humanities, where you deal with big data. And of course, some of your aviation records would be perfect for that kind of thing. I'm surprised that nobody has has gotten their hands on, has done that to them yet.
Next question is directed, is for Professor Spector and Mr. Frank. What is your take on how the writing and interpretation of the war in Asia has handled the vast movements against colonialism that led to the post-war situation being marked with conflict, but directly tied to the decolonization process? The independence movements in Indonesia and Malaya, the wars in Indochina, the decolonization of India seen in movements led by Gandhi, etc. How do you see the writing of the Pacific War, including these massive political eruptions exacerbating by World War II?
Yes, well, I would direct you to my forthcoming book, which actually deals with that question. I mean, it's pretty clear, and many historians have pointed out that for the Asia was basically a continent of colonies pretty much before 1941, and the great catalyst, not that there weren't movements for independence before 1941, but the great catalyst, the thing that changes everything, is the war and the Japanese occupation of most of Asia. And so that's what starts things off. It also fatally weakens the former colonial powers, so that the stage is set for the beginning of decolonization. What I tried to point out in my last book and my forthcoming book is that decolonization is not a simple process. It's not just the formerly colonized versus the former colonizers, that within the movement against colonization, there's also very important fissures within these movements, and they remind me of the old cliche that historians of the American Revolution used to use in the 1930s and 40s. They were very interested in the idea that the American Revolution was not just about home rule, it's about who will rule at home. I don't know whether that holds up in American history or not, but it's a very good description of what happens in former colonial Asia after the end of World War II.
Yeah, I'd agree, obviously, with all of that. The one dimension that is striking to me is that one of the issues that literally goes down right to today, when you look at the relationships between Japan, China, Japan, Korea, Japan, most of the places that Japan occupied, a really big issue among all these other Asian nations and peoples is they're not happy memories, to say the least, of the Japanese occupation. And particularly in China, where it's now a huge feature of popular history in China. Chinese television is replete with movies and stories about the Japanese occupation of China, and sort of the Chinese resisting the Japanese and the Japanese. And that forms still a current framework by which many of these Asian nations still look at the world they're in with Japan.
Next question. We have a robust literature stemming from the war itself on the campaigns in 1992 to 1944 that dealt with the Solomon's campaign and the Central Pacific Operation. But do we have a similarly robust scholarship that deals with the impact of the war on the Pacific Islanders? This question is for Mr. Frank and Professor Spector.
Well, the short answer is no, we don't. It's been so far a very sporadic appearance of accounts that really cover the perspectives of the islanders. Now, the one thing I would say that strikes me in looking sort of at the war in a global context is that in Europe, we now recognize that the war caused enormous numbers of non-combatant deaths from bombing and also from just fighting, whatever here. And one thing that's been striking to me when you look at the war across the Pacific, there are very few places where very large numbers of non-combatants are killed in a lot of those campaigns. The most conspicuous example is Okinawa, for instance. Other places like on Guadalcanal, there were, I think, something on the order of like 8,000 members of the local populace during the campaign between August 42 and February 43. And I think the total is like, there were like 41 or 44 deaths in that whole period among the non-combatants who were living on Guadalcanal, which is, by comparison with what would have happened in anything parallel to that in Europe, is remarkably low. But I've only seen a few accounts. One recent one is about the Solomon Islanders, which just came out by a scholar who's Solomon Islander herself or whatever, which I think takes some of the more rosy glow about how loyal and faithful and happy the Solomon Islanders were with the Allied forces, particularly the American forces. But at the same time, she has one really fascinating observation, because the Solomon Islanders are very dark skinned, whatever here. One takeaway that they got from the war, when they saw American black service members who were wearing the same uniforms as the other Americans, eating the same food, living in the same, they really thought, you know, this was a very potent symbol to them about the struggle for equality.
There are some monographs on this subject, but they don't, it's hard to even find them in the US. About 20 years ago, when I first started teaching the World War II seminar, there was an Australian historian who came and talked about, he was from university in the Northern Territories in Australia, and he talked about the impact of the war on the Aboriginal peoples in the Northern Territory. It was mostly negative, but that's something that I actually haven't seen in print. I presumably he wrote some articles or books, but it hasn't really penetrated the American, hasn't come up on the American radar at all.
Next question. Roberta Wohlstetter's book on Pearl Harbor, written decades ago. How would you assess her work today?
I think that a lot of the book is still relevant. She didn't have all of the scholarship that's since come out about Pearl Harbor, but I think her model of the mindset of the people at the time still works. And there's been a lot of academic work among psychologists and political scientists about surprise attacks and why they are often successful and why it's very costly and uncomfortable for governments and military establishments to prepare against surprise attacks, to really take measures against surprise attacks. So that's a pretty well-plowed field, especially since actually her book grew out of the concern in the US during the 1960s and 70s that the danger of surprise attack had become much greater in the nuclear age. And so how we couldn't afford a successful surprise attack by the other side in an age of nuclear terror, so that we had to be extra, we had to have a better understanding of why surprise takes place.
Thank you. There's a question from Matthew Sommer, history faculty at Stanford. What lessons or insights does the Pacific War provide for the prospects of a possible conflict between the United States and China, and for the nature of such a conflict? It's for the panel. Anybody would like to address that question?
Well, that to me gets us into giving crystal ball opinions, which is extremely difficult to do at this time. My long-term view has been, based on what I understood about this, was that I was a lot more optimistic about U.S.-China relations in the long run. I was concerned about the short run. And within the very recent history, I've become a lot more concerned about the short run. I'm concerned about what Xi really, his ultimate goals and ambitions. And part that shaped that is his rewriting of Chinese history about the War of Resistance, to me, is sort of ominous in its tone. It's less candid, more nationalistic, and also creates sort of this record of China diminished and betrayed, whatever here, for which some sort of retribution might be appropriate. That's what concerns me right now. But you know, I'm still hopeful that we're not heading into a full-scale war with China.
There's a question that relates to the one I just put to you all. With the emerging economic and strategic prominence of China with influence on its surrounding regions, especially given the Korean Peninsula, what role does modern Japan play? What role does modern Japan play in contributing stability to the region, and to what extent do the historical Japanese colonial narratives influence the diplomatic relations with other Asian enmities? Somewhat a complicated question, but the role of Japan today for international regional security, peace and security.
I guess I would just say that it is no longer adequate for the U.S. to view security in the Pacific as a unilateral exercise, that if China is going to be successfully engaged, and I hate to say it, in some cases successfully deterred, that has to be a multilateral exercise. And that as a result of that, you know, Japan is certainly an important player. There's obviously a lot of emotional baggage that comes along with that in the context of Japan's immediate neighbors and also some of the places that she occupied. But to me, it's inescapable that Japan will probably continue to be a very well-armed, if peaceful, nation. And I would expect that level of armament is likely to increase, unfortunately. I would say, too, that another important regional pivot point becomes India, in that the Indian subcontinent has the requisite mass of people and also latent economic potential to potentially act as a bulwark against China, and that their core outlook and I think values very much match ours as well. And so we should be working to actively engage the Indians as well in a collective security arrangement. But yeah, it's a very complex situation.
Okay, final question is for Professor Spector. In his famous 1960 Newport lecture, Nimitz said, and I quote, that nothing that happened during the war was a surprise, absolutely nothing except the kamikaze, end of quote. Could you please discuss any potential exceptions to this, and perhaps the nature of memory you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, there was one big exception to that. That was MacArthur. Nobody anticipated in the Orange Plan, the Central Pacific Drive greatly resembled the Orange Plan. So you could say, in that sense, that Nimitz was correct. But what he didn't anticipate is that there would be an entire rival theater, so to speak, another approach to Japan that involved land forces, large land forces, as well as this kind of naval attack across the Pacific. So I would say that that's true for the Central Pacific campaign, but there's lots of other surprises besides the atomic bomb that It was not anticipated at the Naval War College.
Thank you, Professor Spector, Mr. Paschal, Mr. Frank. Thank you for taking part in this symposium today. And I'd like to thank all Zoom participants for being with us today. Now I'd like to turn things over to Kei Ueda, the curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection, for concluding remarks and information on the future events of the Fanning the Flame Speaker Series, as well as the ongoing online and physical exhibitions.
Thank you, Professor Totani. On behalf of the Hoover Institution Library and Archives and our audience, we thank you for your insightful talks and discussion today. We also thank the Fuchida family for their generosity and extraordinary efforts in preserving Captain Mitsuo Fuchida's private collection for 8 decades. It was my great pleasure working with you. Please visit our interactive online exhibit at fanningtheflames.hoover.org, which includes access to video recording of events and more information about wars and propaganda of the Empire of Japan. We also hope you come by Hoover Tower to visit the accompanying physical exhibition that is now open to Stanford affiliates. For a broader public viewing, please visit our website next year to check it out. We also hope you join us for our future events in the Fanning the Flame Speaker Series. Professor Reiko Tsuchiya speaking on the Allied Forces anti-Japanese propaganda campaign on January 27th, and a talk by Professor Kayako Takeda on American Christian missionaries' intelligence activities during World War II, which will be held on February 18th, 2022. Again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in January.